Hey guys, Ron here. Hope everybody's well. There's some music in the background which is fitting for my topic tonight, but it's not from the artist that I'm going to talk about tonight. And I'm going to show you the boats and the ocean. I'm such an addict. I didn't get to see any of the waves today, even for 10 minutes. So I'm going to go look at it now at night and you guys can come along with me. Tonight I'm going to talk about Rick Nelson and what happened to him. And it's a very, very interesting and a tragic story, as many stories in rock and roll are. And so these guys are going to... I like the music. It's rock. It's pop. Anyway, we're going to talk about Rick Nelson. We're going to talk about exactly what happened. And just to let you know, a lot of my research is based on multiple interviews with his sons Gunnar and Matthew, and a little bit with his son Sam, and a little bit with daughter Tracy, but mostly Gunnar and Matthew, because Gunnar and Matthew are two very well-spoken guys. They're passionate about their own music and their own group, the Nelsons, and they really, their lives changed completely just by being the sons of Rick Nelson, by living with Rick Nelson, when, especially at a time when they actually got to spend some time with him when he wasn't touring for a 6-month period right before he died, and by what happened with their parents. So I'm going by mostly Gunnar and Matthew, what they say and what others have said. So tonight, let's talk about Rick Nelson. I didn't realize how popular Rick Nelson was. I mean, I didn't know he sold 60 million albums. I mean, that's tremendous. Rick Nelson was the first teen idol. In fact, teen idol was named after him, that phrase. So, of course, it started with the father, Ozzie Nelson, not his real name, but I can't remember his real name, and his mother, oh no, excuse me, Ozzie Nelson was Ozzie Nelson's real name. Harriet Nelson was not Harriet's real name, but doesn't matter. Oh, it's the boat out there making all the noise. So Ozzie was a band leader, and Ozzie and Harriet had 2 kids, David and Ricky. And David was the older one. And eventually Ozzie was a real entrepreneur and a very successful band leader, and eventually they got a radio show, the Nelsons, and in the radio show they had actors playing David and Ricky. But eventually when the TV show came around, which ran incidentally for 14 seasons, was before my time, but I know I've seen some Ozzie and Harriet episodes, and it was iconic as far as America of the 50s and into the 60s and Americana, shall we say. By the time the show Ozzie and Harriet came along, as I said, it ran about 14 seasons, which is amazing in and of itself. The brothers were on the show. So it's here you have a real family. You have Ozzie and you have Harriet and you have Dave and you have Ricky. And the boys were funny, and it was a great show. And at some point, so they're here, the kids, the boys are acting from the time they're little babies, basically. They're in show business with their family, with their father. So when Rick was, I can go back and forth because he wanted to be known as simply Rick eventually. But when Rick was then known as Ricky Nelson, when Ricky was about 17, the story he told was that he wanted to make a record. He told a girlfriend that he had that he wanted to make a record just for her, like a one-off, to make a record and hand it to her. And I actually don't know if that ever happened, but I know that he did ask Ozzie if he could sing at the sound check for the show. He loved Carl Perkins. He had by that time become a pretty good guitar player by 17. I didn't start playing until I was 19, and it was all rudimentary for me at that point. So Ricky asked if he could sing at the sound check, and what he wanted to sing was a big hit at the time by Fats Domino called I'm Walking. I'm walking, yes indeed I'm talking, yes indeed I'm walking. Okay, so he sings I'm Walking, and somehow it led to him releasing, doing his version of the song, and he put out his own album. Ozzie secured, let's see if I can get past these people. Ozzie secured a record deal for him. Ozzie had a lot of pull in the entertainment industry. Puts out his first record, Ricky does, at age 17, and it goes to #1. Could you imagine? #1, your first record right out of the gate. Next year, he has a #1 single, Poor Little Fool. And that was not his only #1. So great success came very, very quickly for Ricky. He was also a very handsome young guy. The girls were crazy about him. And when Elvis went in the Army in '58, it was Ricky. Ricky kind of took over the reins of that teen idol status. And you know, because of the reputation of the show, parents weren't put off by him. He didn't have long sideburns like Elvis. He didn't gyrate like Elvis. So 1958, American parents were not upset by the influence of Ricky. Now, God, how things have changed. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. He'd be considered so innocent today, be laughed off the stage. I don't even want to know what's coming in the next 5 or 10 years, but that's okay. So, his career started to wane in the early 60s. And then he met a girl. He had, at least his prior girlfriend had been the girl from who he had met on the show. But after they broke up, he met Chris Harmon. And her father was a great football player. I believe her mother was an actress. Her brother Mark became a fairly well-known actor. He is currently married to an actress named Pam Dauber. So it's a show business family, Chris Harmon and her family. Now, when they were dating, Chris got pregnant with their oldest child, their daughter Tracy, and they got married, and Rick later described it as a shotgun wedding, which is an old antiquated phrase because people don't get married when they get pregnant anymore necessarily. The father may not even stay in the picture, or as they call them, the sperm donors. Totally different world now, as we know. In fact, a new phrase has been invented: baby daddy, baby mama. But in those days, in 1963, if a guy got a woman pregnant, he did the honorable thing and he married her, generally speaking, and they got married. Lisa Marie was born to Elvis and Priscilla 9 months to the day of their wedding. That's pretty close there. But I never heard of any particular controversy. The fact that obviously Chris was pregnant when they got married, but coming out of the 50s into the early 60s, things were changing. And by 1966, 67, 68, it wasn't as big a deal as it was a few years, really. After the Kennedy assassination, after the Beatles broke, things really changed in America. But let's get back to the topic. So, they have Tracy. They're going along. A couple of years later, they have the twin boys, Gunnar and Matthew. And Rick actually did a movie also, but I skipped over that. 1959, did a film called Rio Bravo. He could have really, in my opinion, gone on and been a hell of an actor. Either the studios didn't think so, or he just wasn't inclined to do that. Now his sons say that, and other people say that his real love was music, was being a singer, and that acting was not his passion. So maybe that's why he didn't follow it. Although he certainly did a lot of TV, particularly in the 70s or very early 80s. Although I would imagine that was mostly for money. At 17, 18, Rick was earning so much money. It was unheard of. I mean, If you have $1,000, you have $100,000 when you're 17 in 1957. Can you imagine? 58, 59. You know what that would be now? You know, I don't want to cast any aspersions, but I think that the parents held on to his money. I think Ozzie held on to it a little too tightly. They actually gave him an allowance. So he was not, you know, the Justin Bieber or whoever of his time, which is good. I mean, if Rick Nelson got so famous at 17, I guess because of the times, the somewhat much more conservative nature of the country and of America, conservative nature of his parents, and maybe even himself, I don't know. You know, he did not implode. Like today, as we know, there are no rules. So you get famous at 17. These days, it's you know, drugs, sex, mental illness, therapy, rehab. I was going to say sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but I should probably say sex, drugs, and, you know, rap or hip hop, which is the dominant music now, not rock anymore, sadly to say. So, and there's the ocean. So, through the 60s, Rick's playing all the time. He's on tour all the time. And as his career wanes, he's touring for income. That's really the only way to get it, especially when you're not primarily a songwriter without publishing. So he's touring. Chris is getting more and more frustrated and upset at him being away from home. And Rick eventually forms what he calls the Stone Canyon Band. And I mean, for a while it's so bad he's doing revivals and county fairs and things like that. His career has really kind of bottomed out. And then he did an oldies review well, he's kind of trying to piggyback off for a concert in 1969. He had some success again. And then in 1972, he's doing a concert at Madison Square Garden with other rockers from the 50s, or kind of a rock and roll revival. And he was almost booed off the stage. Now, it might not have been entirely his fault. I mean, I've read that there was some kind of police activity that night too, but essentially it doesn't matter, because his belief that he was being booed off the stage because he wasn't playing the old songs that people wanted to hear or expected from him. And his thought was, man, you know, you can't please everyone, you've got to please yourself. And out of that concert came the song that he's actually probably most known for, a signature song, Garden Party. And you know, when I hear Garden Party, I don't know what it is. I never met Rick Nelson. I wasn't a huge Rick Nelson fan, although I know the singles, the hits. When I hear Garden Party, it makes me very sad. I sometimes even get a little emotional, and it triggers something in me. But essentially, if you haven't heard the Garden Party from 1972, which was a top 10 hit, and gave him a very brief quote-unquote comeback, he describes the song, he describes who was there. There's a line that says, Yoko brought her walrus, obviously being John, and he finally says, if you can't, you know, the chorus says, you can't please everyone, you got to please yourself. And that was, he tried to live by that. It's interesting because when I see interviews with Rick Nelson and when I hear his music, his affect was never particularly all that emotional. I sense a melancholy in his music, a melancholy in his voice, maybe just because he had a very sweet voice, but a melancholy, and a melancholy about him. Now, Gunnar and Matthew, his sons, dispute that. No one ever used the word, you know, Dad was happy-go-lucky, but I think that there was an inherent sadness to him. And I think that, you know, the worst thing that can happen, in my opinion, you know, that old saying, you know, it's better to have loved than lost than to have never loved at all. I don't know about that. And I think the same is with fame and celebrity and when you're an artist. Because to have reached the heights that he reached, and then to become sort of not a parody of oneself, but by the late 70s and early 80s, it was essentially all over. And if things couldn't get worse, I mean, career-wise, not all over, but he was struggling. You know, it's like those bands that struggled to get a record deal. By the early 80s, John Denver, who was at the top of the charts in the early 70s and mid-70s, couldn't get a record deal in 1982. This happens. This is the ebb and flow sometimes. And it certainly happened to Rick Nelson. So in 1977, he came home from tour and Chris had thrown him out. And about a month, she had an apartment rented for him. And she came over, I would imagine somewhat unexpectedly, about a month later. And apparently, according to her at least, he had 2 Rams cheerleaders there. He was partying up like a rock star. Now I was going to say Raiderettes, but they were not the Rams cheerleaders. Anyway, before the Raiders came to town. Anyway, and it just added to the drama. Now, they did eventually reconcile, and they bought a house, actually the old Errol Flynn house, up on Mulholland, which, boy, would I love to film that house, but it's been demolished. It's several parcels of property, and it did have the trapdoors. It did have the see-through glass, you know, the one-way glass, and those are the debauchery days of Errol Flynn. Anyway, they bought that house, and the marriage did not last. Now, it's important for me to speak about the dissolution of the marriage between Rick and Chris Nelson, Chris Harmon, Chris Nelson, because both of them claimed they were drug users and heavy-duty alcoholics, unfit parents. This was a terrible, terrible, protracted divorce that eventually cost Rick Nelson $1 million and completely destroyed him financially. He was already in bad shape, and this made everything terrible. In fact, he was responsible for the kids' medical bills and clothing, and I believe their schooling, and just about everything. Now, to hear Gunnar and Matthew tell it, they say, and Tracy as well actually, says that their mother, Chris, was not only a drug user and an alcoholic. In fact, we know this because 2 years after Rick Nelson, her former husband died, her late husband died, or no, her ex-husband died, she went into rehab. And it wasn't, I don't believe it was the only time she was in rehab, but Matthew and Gunnar say that Chris was possibly bipolar, a narcissist, maybe a borderline personality. And borderline personality makes more sense to me because she was really infuriated when Rick would do what Rick did, and that was travel sometimes 300 days a year out of 365. Now, I don't know how you keep a marriage together when you only see them a couple months of the year, your spouse, but, you know, Rick was committed to paying the bills, and I guess obviously we can all understand that. But Chris was very, very, very frustrated by that. In fact, she wanted him to quit the business and stay home and just be a husband and father, and as far as he was concerned, that was never going to happen. So they did break up, and like I said, a very, very contentious divorce, costing him $1 million. And the next 5 years were really bad, just like Elvis's final 5 years. So Gunnar and Matthew ended up staying with, actually she was not allowed custody, I believe. Gunnar and Matthew ended up staying with Rick up at the Mulholland house. But of course Rick was touring all the time. So when they were starting to rehearse and being a band themselves in the mid-80s and early to mid-80s and playing clubs around Los Angeles with their band, as their band Nelson, they actually had to hire a car to take them from to rehearsals, and sometimes from their mom's house in Brentwood up to the Mulholland house. But they were left alone in that Mulholland house quite a lot. How these guys ended up as sane as they did is amazing. So Rick, for the next 5 years, is touring pretty relentlessly, and he has a girlfriend named Helen eventually, and I do believe that Helen moved in with him. Now, it's interesting to note that Harriet, his mom, did not like Helen, and band management, his management people, did not like Helen. I haven't heard any of the kids, any of the 4 of them, speak about what they thought about her, but she was not well liked by Rick's mom and by the family, and I don't exactly know what the issue was. There's the kids don't present their father as a saint, but they also don't trash talk him really ever. Now, some band member, people in the band just say that, Rick was not a saint. I mean, in rock and roll, there's drinking, there's drugs. I would imagine that maybe, although I'm just speculating, maybe Helen was using too many substances or drinking too much, or they thought she was sort of a bad influence. I really don't know. But Rick's touring. He's with Helen now, and he got with her very, very quickly after the divorce from Chris. And as he's touring, he's going to be in Texas for New Year's Eve 1985 going into 1986. So the plan was, actually, he had invited his boys Gunnar and Matthew, who were 18 at the time, actually still living with Rick, at the Mulholland house, the old Errol Flynn house. And what they have said was that it was unusual that for the prior about 6 months, when they were playing clubs in LA and hanging out primarily in LA, they actually got to spend time with him, because it was a rare time when Dad wasn't touring. So they did actually have about a 6-month period where they got to see him a lot. And he came to their gigs around LA or wherever when he could. He didn't see a lot of them because he was always touring himself. So he has this gig. Oh, let me back up. So Rick had bought Jerry Lee Lewis's DC-3. He was very terrified of flying, but he felt safe in his own plane, this DC-3. Apparently, it flew very slowly, as slowly as like 80 miles an hour. And he figured if, God forbid, they had some kind of a problem with a plane flying that slow, they could land in a cornfield or a football stadium or a football field or somewhere where they could safely land. So the plan was they were going to do 2 nights of concerts, and then Rick and his band were going to fly on the plane, I believe, to Dallas and do a New Year's Eve show. Or it might have been a New Year's Day show. I think it was a New Year's Eve show. Anyway, so Rick had actually invited his boys, Gunnar and Matthew, on the plane. They had never been on the plane. So the plan was, he had asked the guys to take a commercial plane out to where he was, and then they were going to fly the plane. They were going to join their dad on the plane with Rick's band and fly into Dallas, and they were going to spend New Year's Eve together. So the guys planned to do this, and they had a lot of friends in town for New Year's Eve, friends that were on break from college, and they were going to spend time with their friends, but they weren't going to pass up their dad's invitation. So strangely enough, they were packed to go. Everything was ready to go. They were packed up at the Mulholland house. They were going to go to LAX, they say, the next day, take the flight out, commercial flight out. And Rick Nelson called them, and he told his sons, and they say he sounded strange, and that, was this a premonition? Was this kind of weird foreshadowing? We'll never know. But they said he was very adamant, and he said to the sons, he said that he had changed his mind, and he was very adamant. He said, he wanted them to alter the plans, just wait 2 days, and then or maybe a day, and then take a commercial plane straight to Dallas, while he would fly with his band in his plane, and they'd all meet up in Dallas and spend New Year's Eve together. And they did. The brothers kind of reluctantly agreed on the phone, but he said afterward they were thinking about it, and they thought, to fly out the same day, basically they were going to fly out now, commercial, same day, see their dad in Dallas, and then fly back commercial that same night or the next day. They said it just wasn't worth it to them. It was too much. It was too big a trip. Even 18-year-olds aren't infallible, right? I don't know what I mean, but at 18. So they decided they would stay home, and I don't know what they did. I think they saw some friends. But what's ironic is, what's meaningful is, according to Gunnar and Nelson, the bulk of their friends, if not all their friends in LA, thought that they were on that plane. So Gunnar is driving, and he had somebody in the car with him. He hasn't said who. And I've heard this before. This is what DJs used to do. They played about 3 Rick Nelson songs in a row, and he said it was he thought it was weird that they were playing 3 of his dad's songs in a row, and they finished with Garden Party, his signature song. And he said he had pulled over by that time, thank God. And Gunnar says that the DJ said, after a long pause after the last note in Garden Party, that the DJ said, "This is a tribute to Rick Nelson, who died today in a plane crash." And Gunnar says he just remembered getting out of the car, not believing it, and fainting, and not being conscious. And about 5 minutes afterwards, Matthew, I turned that around. That was happening to Matthew. 5 minutes later, Gunnar heard it on TV. And that's the way they found out. And they're, embittered to this day about it. And I don't blame them. The family was not notified first. The press had it first before the family was notified. So the plane crashed. We can actually hear recordings from the cockpit that still exist about the plane crash. And there was smoke in the cockpit. Now, ironically and miraculously, the pilots survived. Rick and his entire band, died in the crash, burned to death. Now, almost immediately there was speculation that, and I remember this being when I was just a couple years older than Gunnar and Matthew at the time. In fact, Rick Nelson had played my high school the year before I graduated. That's out in Palm Springs. That's how, where I was doing music, where I did a musical the next year. So I know that was like I think 1,000 or a 2,000 seat auditorium. And we filled it. But, from him going from whatever he was playing to, 1,000 or 2,000 seats, that's kind of sad. One sec. With the almost immediate speculation was that Rick or someone in the band or all of them, or none of the above, were freebasing, and that the plane caught on fire because they were freebasing, and that's why it exploded. Now, this was only, maybe 5 years after the infamous Richard Pryor incident with freebasing, so that was in people's minds. I don't believe it. I think the NTSB did I'm sure they did a investigation. Like I said, the pilot survived. And what they said was, I believe, and we'll have to fact check me on this, was that there was a problem with the heating section, with the heater on the plane, that literally fuel filling up in the heating compartment, or some issue with the heater. And because it was, it was New Year's Eve, it was December 31st, it was cold, and they were using the heater, and using that heater caused a fire, and hence the smoke in the cabin that the pilots. I don't believe the freebasing story. Personally speaking, there are a lot of people that, I was going to say did or just didn't know at the time, and I think that was sensationalized. I don't know whether the pilots said that or not, and I would imagine that the pilots would have put the kibosh on that as being too dangerous right away. Although we know that David Crosby would freebase in commercial planes. How he got away with that in the 80s with the torch and the pipe between his legs in a parka, I have no idea. David Crosby freebased while he was driving, and he freebased in little private planes in the back as well. So I don't happen to believe, but that was a theory at the time. So it was, it was a tragic end to a career that had been really monumental. And I think that I almost think that Rick might have become a country artist. He had become really enamored of country rock, and I think that might have been the direction he went afterwards. He certainly had the voice for it. Anyway, guys, it was a real pleasure to do this. This particular subject is interesting to me. I think I should do one on John Denver as well. Henry John Deutschendorf, because John Denver is another melancholy, sad guy who died tragically in a plane crash, although he unfortunately crashed his own plane inadvertently. Alright guys, Ron here. If you like the channel, please subscribe. If you do subscribe, please hit the little bell icon next to the subscription button, and then you'll be notified when I post. And please give me likes. And as you know, I will most likely respond to your comments if you're one of my folks that comments on a semi-regular basis. I love the dialogue. I even set some nasty comments right. There aren't many, but sometimes they're wrong in their criticism of me, and I'll set them straight. Oh yeah. Okay guys, I'll see you at the next location. Thank you. Bye bye.